This is an ad by BetterHelp. What's your perfect night? Is it curling up on the couch for a cozy, peaceful night in? Therapy can feel a bit like that, your comfort place where you replenish your energy. With BetterHelp, get matched with a therapist based on your needs entirely online. It's convenient and suited to your schedule. Find comfort this season with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. What's your perfect night? Maybe you're settled at home alone or with loved ones, covered in blankets, about to watch your favorite show. It's cozy, it's calm, and you're ready for a perfect night in. Therapy can feel a bit like that. A place for comfort. A time when you replenish your energy and take care of yourself. And hey, you can even do it without leaving that same cozy couch. This season is the perfect time to give therapy a try, right from the comfort of home. With BetterHelp, get matched with a tailored therapist based on your needs and preferences, entirely online. Designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a therapist, and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find comfort this season with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast. For those about to read and rock, we're online at bookedonrock.com. You can find every episode in audio and video segment highlights from episodes, got a blog, find out the latest rock book releases, and also the Booked on Rock store. Check it out, get some merchandise while you're there. Author Ross Warner is making his first appearance on the podcast. Ross is the author of the brand new book, American Standard, Cheap Trick from the Bars to the Budokan and Beyond. Warner tells the unlikely story of the band's path to greatness, from their origins in Rockford, Illinois, to their massively successful live album, At Budokan, to the many, many ups and downs that followed. Drawing on exhaustive research and interviews, American Standard gives an intimate look at a truly original band, and we're going to talk about the book and the band right now with Ross Warner. A Cheap Trick playlist can be found in this episode's show notes. Welcome to the podcast, Ross. How are you, man?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
We're having a moment of peace here because you're a Chargers fan. I'm a Steelers fan. They may very well meet up very soon in the playoffs, but until then,
and also I will mention it's in my book, but I think I might have mentioned to you in our exchanges. I was at the AFC Championship game in 1990.
Yes. Oh yeah, we had some. You showed me a picture of you with Dan Fouts.
Picture of me at Fouts. There's a picture of me, much fatter than me. Gave me the finger the night before the game, sleeping in my Charger flag, a la Who on the cover of the Kids Are All Right. So unfortunately, Alan Paul, also, who's an author and wrote a book of the Almonds and has written a book about Stevie Ray Vaughan. He's from Pittsburgh, so he's a Steelers fan. And,
I didn't know. I had Alan on. I didn't even know he was from.
Alan's Pittsburgh is iconic. Iron City, Myron Cope. Yeah, I mean, I know Alan because I've been basically pestering him for the last 15 years. I read his book when I was with my wife. Where were we? We might have been. We're on vacation. I think we're in Aruba, and I read his book, Big in China, and I was reading it, and I was like, oh, he likes music. He talked about his dad. He liked, sports, but he's from Pittsburgh. And then we just started going back and forth. And yeah, I've just been bothering him basically ever since. So
he was on to talk about his latest Almonds book. And
brother and sister, sure.
I would have certainly brought that up if
I'll mention to him because he hurt his foot, so he may be at the Mule. I'm going on the 30th. My days of New Year's shows are done, but he will be there. But yeah, the day after the Charger game, he did send me an email with a weird amount of shit talking. I was like, oh, okay, all right. And I was like, I'll definitely keep that in mind. But my Cheap Trick.
Yeah, when did you become a fan of Cheap Trick? How did you become a fan?
It's funny. I put in the book, I say this a lot now, but I first heard Cheap Trick when I was a kid. I'm 53 years old. I know I look every bit of it. So I heard Cheap Trick really for the first time, the Mad Magazine movie, Up the Academy, which is one of the worst movies you will ever see. It's available on DVD. It's I don't know if you've ever seen. Even the trailer is wildly inappropriate. I mean, Ralph Macchio was in it. Robert Downey Sr. directed it. It was an awful Animal House kind of ripoff. It was such a bad film that William Gaines, the late creator of Mad, wrote letters to everybody saying how bad it was. But in the movie, I did hear Surrender, which was really the first Cheap Trick song I heard. The movie was on HBO in 1980, 81. We had early HBO. 80, 81, 82. I was 11. So music, I mean, I was obviously getting obsessed with Eric Coryell, but music I was starting to get into. And then when I really rediscovered Cheap Trick was in the late 90s because after obviously I stopped going to Dead shows. I was living in the East Village from 1995 sorry, 1993 to 2005. And I was going to all those places at St. Mark's, picking up promo copies of CDs, used CDs. But I got a hold of the Cheap Trick Complete Budokan. And I knew Cheap Trick Budokan like everybody else did. Obviously, I was aware of, and I put it in the book, of the sampling of Robin Zander during Jimmy James by the Beastie Boys, which I did, speak to Jonathan Zwickle, who was a biographer for the Beastie Boys, to get a little insight into that, if it was as random as it seemed. Because for some people, it's literally when they hear this is the first song on our new album.
From Check Your Head.
It's the first.
Love the Beasties.
Right, and it's the first song on their new album, and it was actually the first time they played their instruments. So I remember very vividly being in a car in Rochester, in the back seat of my friend's car, and we had just gotten on cassette, I think, at Rochester's House of Guitars. And I remember I was like, this isn't the Beasties, because I mean, I heard Paul's Boutique, but I'd never heard live concert stage patter sampled. And also, it's one of the few examples that people would pick up on. So in the late 90s, 97, 98, when they put out the Cheap Trick Complete concert, was when I started really getting into them, because that's when I heard the stuff that wasn't on the original release. That's when I heard Downed. That's when I heard Auf Wiedersehen. That's when I heard Southern Girls, which I knew, but I had never heard, the Budokan version. And that's when I, really started to kind of get into them. And then again, of course, they were at that point back to being kind of a cult band. As in 1997, they tried to rebrand themselves with a great album that is kind of lost in the annals of mainstream, not to a Cheap Trick fan, but their Red Ant album. And then once Red Ant goes belly up, they are trying to kind of rebrand themselves by being nostalgic, but also being, forward thinking. So they put out the Complete Budokan, which is a combination of the original Budokan and then Budokan 2, which was all the tracks they had recorded, including some from 79. Those, I know Bunny Carlos had confirmed to me, they actually put an additional applause track on them. So they're almost like unlistenable, the ones from Budokan 2. So Bruce Dickinson, not the one from Iron Maiden, but yes, the namesake of More Cowbell, Bruce Dickinson, who produced Dylan's Biograph, one of the first, box sets I remember in high school of unreleased material. He worked on the Complete Budokan in 98. Jack Douglas worked on, with Jay Messina, the 30th anniversary one. And when I heard all those songs together, I was like, wow. I was like, this band really, kicked ass. And they were also starting to tour. I didn't see them when they were doing their album shows in 98, which is interesting because they really, Cheap Trick, I put in the book, I think they are the first band to do albums start to finish. They didn't intend to do that.
Really?
Yeah, I think when they did the Metro stand in 98, that became the source for Music with Hangovers. They did Budokan, the Complete Budokan. So they were doing all the songs, which they had to relearn a lot of them. Bunny Carlos interviewed at the time, I remember, had said, like, they weren't doing a lot of those songs. And then they did, of course, the first album, which is some people's favorite, Jack Douglas album. They did In Color live. They did Heaven Tonight live. And then they did like bonus tracks, sort of. They did shows in New York at Irving Plaza, which I missed. The Budokan one was at Roseland. And then in the late 90s, I know the question was, how did I get to Cheap Trick? I started, seeing them. So I saw them at the Hammerstein. I saw them at Town Hall do an acoustic show, which was very cool. I saw them then the following night at Irving Plaza. And then they were starting to play, of course, opening festival type package deals. So I saw them, Jones Beach, open for Aerosmith. I saw them at the Snapple Sunfest in Newport, Rhode Island, playing literally like in a tent in a parking
they'll play. They would and still play
right,
wherever.
Right.
Yeah, they played at Quinnipiac College in Hamden, Connecticut, near New Haven.
I last saw them with Bunny Carlos out in '05. I saw them at the Penny Saver Amphitheater out in Farmingville with Alice Cooper. But everywhere they went, there were people that were just huge Cheap Trick fans that either waited for them to come to town or saw them at every, some of them are writers now for Variety or Revolver, and some of them, been kind enough to kind of promote the book. But they were a huge, cult band again. And, at the same time, then they sort of re-enter the zeitgeist, I guess, obviously with the '70s show. But I mean, you could make the argument. I mean, in some ways, I joke about it. I think I made the same joke on Pat Francis's podcast. But like Pennywise, like, you look back, or Zelig, and, they were almost always there, whether it be, Rick on an episode of Boy Meets World, or, them appearing, with Jeff Garlin and Daddy Daycare. Obviously, 10 Things I Hate About You, Letters for Cleo plays I Want You to Want Me. So that's when I started getting into Cheap Trick.
Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Difficult to see. Always in motion is the future.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. What's your perfect night? Is it curling up on the couch for a cozy, peaceful night in? Therapy can feel a bit like that. Your comfort place where you replenish your energy. With BetterHelp, get matched with a therapist based on your needs, entirely online. It's convenient and suited to your schedule. Find comfort this season with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. What's your perfect night? Maybe you're settled at home alone or with loved ones, covered in blankets, about to watch your favorite show. It's cozy, it's calm, and you're ready for a perfect night in. Therapy can feel a bit like that. A place for comfort, a time when you replenish your energy and take care of yourself. And hey, you can even do it without leaving that same cozy couch. This season is the perfect time to give therapy a try, right from the comfort of home. With BetterHelp, get matched with a tailored therapist based on your needs and preferences entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find comfort this season with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
The thought of writing about them didn't occur for like another 20 years. I used to write in the mid-90s. I wrote my own email newsletter before they were blogs called Justice is Coming, from the tagline of Tombstone, which was, in the 1994 Charger season, my mantra. And then I started writing about music around that time too, whether it be in Dead Bass, the Dead Tape Bible, or the Deadhead's Tape Compendium I wrote for. And then it wasn't until really during COVID, after I'd written the book Drunk on Sunday, which, like I said, is a fictionalized account of my childhood, my life, my concerts, the sports. It's pretty much all true, but it's got more of a dramatic 3-arc structure. I didn't change it to make the Chargers win the Super Bowl. I couldn't fictionalize it that much. That would be too cruel for me.
You couldn't go that far.
But it was really during COVID that I started thinking about writing a book, and I didn't know at the time, like I said, that Doug Broad had already worked on They Seem Just a Little Weird. I wasn't aware of the very hard to get Reputation is a Fragile Thing by Ken Sharp and Mike Hayes, it's like the whiskey box set from Cheap Trick. It's out there for like an insane amount of money. And I did not know about Robert Lawson's Still Competition, although I started reading it. And then I did not know even that Brian Krant was writing his book. And the only reason I found out about it is I actually went on Jawbone, the publisher, their website. I was just looking for places that might be interested in, the proposal. And I saw that. I was like, oh, damn. I was like, I better have a different story to tell. So I didn't realize until speaking to Brian that his story was kind of going to end with Budokan. So what fascinated me enough to write a book was obviously this insane origin story of Cheap Trick. I remember reading comments on YouTube. People were saying Cameron Crowe, who, of course, is Cheap Trick adjacent, because, as I put in the book, Mike Damone's famous testimonial about Cheap Trick is a huge moment for them, especially when it came out in 1982 and they were starting to sink, even though they're not in the movie musically the way they were Over the Edge. A lot of people, and again, when Cheap Trick played Dream Police shows after Bun had left, they had a whole video segment of the references on The Simpsons. They obviously had Mike Damone. I mean, they're aware of all the little name checks that they've gotten. So that's when I started thinking, about writing a book about them. And the Cameron Crowe comment was, I remember somebody had put on a YouTube video, like, they have such a crazy story. What if Cameron Crowe or somebody had, does like a kind of a rags to riches, this weird ragtag group of Rockford musicians, becomes huge in Japan. What would that be like? So I wanted originally to kind of investigate the myths of Budokan. I had put together a proposal for a 33 and a third book on Budokan, which it's crazy that there isn't one on Budokan. What I also had hoped to do was to kind of get a hold of from Bun exactly what songs were from what shows, which I knew Cheap Trick fans would care about because it's weird. It's one of those live albums where what show and what version were never really identified. He was the only one that would know. He said he has the notes. They're buried in what I pretty sure is an enormous amount of papers. He's been releasing obviously bootlegs with Steve Ackery, who's also a Pittsburgh Steelers fan from Pittsburgh.
Ah, good
Yeah,
man.
there are a lot of them. So that was something I wanted to get into because, again, with Cheap Trick, they are a fascinating story because there's the image, there's the mythology. Some of it they created, some of it they leaned into. There's them becoming, I don't want to say the biggest band on the planet, but for a moment, they, obviously on the cover of Rolling Stone, and obviously, they're frozen in time as this band from Budokan. I mean, I, live out here in Long Island, and when I listen to terrestrial radio, rarely, you'll hear obviously on WBAB or across the way in Connecticut, PLR, you'll hear I Want You to Want Me, you'll hear Surrender.
Anybody who's grown up on classic rock radio knows Cheap Trick.
Right.
That's what kept Cheap Trick alive, a big part of it.
Right. And again, he didn't obviously know it because Cameron Crowe's Fast Times book, actually, where he went undercover in high school in San Diego. In the book version, it's not the Pat Benatar look that all the girls are sporting. It's actually the Robin Zander look that all the boys. So he was a huge Cheap Trick fan. But when Mike Damone does cites Dream Police, cites I Want You to Want Me, The Charisma, Robin Zander, and Rick Nielsen, those are the three songs, Dream Police, I Want You to Want Me, and Surrender, that they are forever known for. I mean, we can talk about The Flame, but they are a fascinating study. The only difficulty, like I said to you off the air with Cheap Trick, and I know Pat or Brian or Doug, is that, they're not really, and Susan, who I know, at one point Pat told me, she had a full book deal, like a coffee table
Susan
book.
Messino,
Yeah,
we're talking about.
Yeah, she knew them. I mean, she worked for Ken Adamany during, I put it in my book, during, arguably the most influential time where in 79, she was working in Ken Adamany's office. So when they were in Japan, she was literally answering, the Japanese fan mail. She discussed with me and Ken, who confirmed this, that there was kind of a storage or a closet full of the Japanese fan mail that went to the ceiling. And she had approached them and they kind of nixed it. I again, or Ira Robbins, obviously, of Trouser Press. He was really the first kind of fan, along with Carrie Baker, who I used a lot in my book, who also has a book out now on busking. They were the first ones to really get it, Carrie.
Oh, he's Carrie. I just booked Carrie.
Okay.
I can't wait to get into that book.
Okay. So,
about busking and street musicians. Wow.
He was
Small world. Okay.
He was incredibly helpful.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, his name came up a lot because Carrie was writing, and I'm glad he's returned to writing because he is an excellent writer. All these people that I contacted, maybe not Ira, because Ira was always writing. Carrie got out of writing, obviously got into publicity, IRS records, but Carrie was an OG, to use a term I shouldn't be using as someone as white and Jewish as I am. But Carrie was one of the original Cheap Trick fans, and this I related to a lot, being a deadhead, that, he was in college. They were playing obviously DeKalb, and he was writing about them in a very kind of like the lively times, like in a very almost blogging. It was not a fanzine, but like local way. And he was turning other people who would become big writers and Cheap Trick fans. Don McLeese, who wrote the 33 and the third book on the MC5. Maureen McCormick, who was really helpful. She helped me proofread my book, who would write for Rolling Stone, Billboard, and turning them on to this band. You got to see these guys. They're the combination of, the Move, the Who, obviously the American Beatles. They're so loud, they're so charismatic, and it's a, four-ring circus on stage. And Carrie, ironically, then in 98 ended up being a publicist for Cheap Trick when they came back with those Budokan shows and the Metro shows in 98. So he certainly knows a lot of Cheap Trick and was very, like I said, nice to me. Just some kid bothering him. Now it might seem okay, the book has gotten into Variety and other lists, but at the time, people were like, what is it you want to do exactly? Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story about them because, again, as I went back to Susan, they don't seem really interested in being on the record, and I think I'm the first person to kind of just go into a book on Cheap Trick, like embracing that.
Yeah.
Doug Rhodes seemed just a little weird. I know Ira helped, Rick, see up for those interviews, but I know that, Rick didn't necessarily add anything super illuminating to the story. I mean, like I said, I don't think Rick is consciously holding back the truth at this point. I just think there's certain things, you mentioned about Tom Peterson, that certainly is.
Oh yeah, I'm going to mention something along the way too, if you know this, if you've heard this story.
That's another, thing about Cheap Trick is that, in the case of Tom, and they mentioned it at their Hall of Fame induction, but Tom and Rick were best friends. They went out to England in '68, and O'Brien wrote about it, and I touched on it. Rick
Oh,
talked about
wow. Well, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, get into the origins of the band.
yeah, Rick talked about taking Owsley acid, which is, you do not associate Rick with being on acid or even making a reference to Stanley Bear Owsley, but he talked about that. I think it was in The Quietus, and that's where they heard Beggar's Banquet. That's obviously where they heard the White Album.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
Bam! The future of rock and roll.
Another Cheap Trick fascinating story is that obviously they were hugely influenced by the Beatles. I mean, Rick Nielsen owns every album, every single, every pressing, and yet because maybe it's just simplifying it, because they were loud and they were harmonious, and then obviously they went to Japan and got this Hard Day's Night like welcome in 1978. They were called the American Beatles, which that really was a heavy burden to bear.
Sure.
I mean, I remember, like I said, in '53, I remember, Beatlemania, the show. Unfortunately, I also remember Sgt. Pepper's the movie, but I remember Beatlemania, the show.
Yes.
The interesting thing is, the Beatles thing, they had to kind of hide their love of the Beatles. They were super Beatles fans, more so, I think, John Lennon than just the Beatles. Rick used to wear shirts, before the sweaters that just said, like, I'm not Paul. He loved John Lennon. They loved John Lennon of post Beatles. They loved obviously the cold turkey John Lennon.
And Rick has some great John Lennon stories.
Yeah. Bun and Rick did record with John Lennon in 1980 in August. It was right after Tom left the band or was pushed out of the band, or both, to be honest with you. Rick and Bun were called. Jack Douglas was the one, obviously, that gave them a call. They went through Ken Anamani. I was able to see, because Ken has everything. Like I put in the book, Ken obviously was their manager from the very beginning. He was a big fixture in the Wisconsin music scene. He owned the Factory, which was the place where Otis Redding was supposed to play the night he crashed into the lake. And Ken has literally like the limo bills for Bun and Rick. It's another very Cheap Trick thing that as their band, Cheap Trick, is falling apart, they get a phone call. Jack calls Ken for them to play on Double Fantasy. They go. Bun and Rick especially are the two biggest music nerds of Cheap Trick, like card carrying. I mean, Bun obsessively loves drums, obsessively, he's a taper, taped Cheap Trick, taped other shows. Rick, of course, is, the most famous guitar collector known to man.
Oh, yeah. How many is he up to now? Do we know the number?
I don't even know. I guess there was a website, but he also brought John Lennon.
300 plus.
Yeah, he actually brought John Lennon after the session. He brought them a Hamer guitar, but they get the call. They just got back from Toronto, where Pete Comida was basically flown out to replace Tom. They didn't make any announcement about that. They played these shows. They get the call. Rick has always joked that Dax, who now plays drums, was born during this time, which he was. So Rick has always said that Karen, his wife, has given him a hall pass, which I jokingly said, I don't think Rick understands what hall pass means. That's not what a hall pass means, to play with John Lennon. And given the fact it's a sex joke, I think Rick would absolutely appreciate it. I just don't think he understands when he says it. To quote was The Princess Bride, the words don't mean what you think they do. So
yeah.
But they play on two songs. Bun has told the story that they had just come back from Toronto. Bun, openly talked about, smoking weed back then. So him and John are smoking a joint as Rick is playing a solo. And I guess John had said something to the effect of, I wish I'd had this guy on Cold Turkey, because Eric Clapton, A, was addicted to heroin, and B, didn't really, deliver the solo. Of course, Rick and Bun was reiterated this, loves to tell that story as if he was in the room, because what ends up happening after they're not on the album and John Lennon gets shot, it becomes another blessing and a curse thing, because A, John Lennon, I don't think, was aware of Cheap Trick. I think Jack Douglas was, John Lennon's kids were, but Bun has told the story. Rick had a guitar, and still does. I think I've seen it in pictures, that says Day Tripper, and John Lennon was like, "What is that?" And he's like, "That's my Day Tripper guitar." He's like, "We had a cover of Day Tripper on Found All the Parts, the new disc, 1980 EP. Day Tripper, it's on the charts," and he had no idea. So the story that came out later was like, it became much like all the grunge bands and Kurt Cobain name checking Cheap Trick. It became almost like a weird badge of honor, like John Lennon called us in. But at the same time, that isn't quite what happened. I mean, Bun was, I mean, he got autographs from John and Yoko, which he asked Jack if he could do. And John, I think, wrote "Thanks for the Hop," like a play on the bunny thing. And of course, he signed it with the famous John Lennon caricature signature, which Rick also has been doing. He's never said that that's where he got it from, but it probably is. He signs with his little cartoon of himself. Rick does. Then John and I think Rick went out. Bunn had said that he had to go do his laundry, so he wasn't really sure what happened afterwards. They probably got really drunk. This was obviously, 1980. And then, of course, they're not on the album. And then, John is shot, which Rick had talked about. He was watching the Monday night game where Cosell reported it. He was watching it in the strip club, he said. And that was it. So they had to, it must have been also very weird. Like, Cheap Trick is kind of coming apart. They're eventually going to replace Comida with John Brandt. And they're probably like, we got to play with our idol, who is now dead, and we're not going to be on this album. So it became like, again, another Cheap Trick, mythology, like how that went about, how did it really happen? Greg Prato did a book on John Lennon that I used where he talked a bunch specifically about the sessions. But yeah, different, and it's a very Cheap Trick thing, different stories of that, that Rick heard him say that about Cold Turkey, which he didn't, because of course that is the message in that story is that, Rick would have been better on Cold Turkey than John Lennon. And Cold Turkey is like one of Cheap Trick's earliest covers. They love that. It's 100% like what their sound is kind of founded on, crunchy and, subversive. Robin, before they started writing on their own songs, could do a perfect imitation of almost anybody. That's
the man of 1,000 voices.
Yeah. It was funny because the story about why they didn't appear on the album was that John apparently had said something like, "This sounds too much like Cold Turkey," which had Cheap Trick known that, or had Bunn and Rick known that, that would have been the ultimate compliment, right? I mean, that's exactly that's everything they would have wanted to hear. So yeah, and that becomes again a very Cheap Trick thing because they start the '80s. And you didn't ask this question, but the biggest complaint I've gotten or on reviews is, why wasn't the book longer? Why didn't you get into the '80s? Why didn't you talk about Tom? And I tell people that, well, the truth is that obviously I got a book deal from Backbeat Books, which is owned by Bloomsbury, and they came in with a hard page count saying I couldn't go over it. So, I kind of had to refocus the scope of it, but I certainly would consider, and hopefully if the book does well, of going back and doing, because I did enough research for an entire biography. I mean, I have downstairs, it's like my favorite progressive spokesman, Dr. Rick, when he says you don't have to print the internet. Like, I did print the internet. I have folders and folders of just such 1970s Midwestern concert reviews where there's like, Spy Who Loved Me in the Drive-In, like Cheese Fondue Place, Porn Theater, Cheap Trick Review. I mean, it just, which again, I had to kind of use because I knew I wasn't really going to, speak to the members of Cheap Trick. I mean, I did get a lot of information out of Bunny Carlos. Kim and Ken both actively sat with Brian Cramp for his book, and I think
Ken Voss, you talking about?
No, Ken Adamany.
Ken, oh yeah, okay. Because I was going to ask you about Ken Voss.
Yeah,
He's got
Ken
a great
Voss,
story.
Yeah, he was in the book. I put him in the book. He told a great story about seeing them. He was the one that told me about the wet T-shirt contest.
Yeah.
And just like that's where I started to make the comparison, which I think I included to like almost the Dead and the Fillmore and the Avalon, because those bars, one bar would end with a liquor license, and he said like people would go outside and like they'd be blazing sun and they'd have a Bloody Mary in their hand.
Yeah.
And then they would go down, they would go to the night gallery or go this or that. And, there were people on Facebook who had talked about, I didn't use their names, but they insinuated that basically, they had to put sunglasses on because the amount of coke they needed to like drive home.
Ken Voss owned the Illinois Entertainer.
Yeah. And they were a huge early, he's great. I mean, he has told me a great story that I don't think he'd mind me saying, that I think it might have been the Sgt. Pepper shows where he saw Rick backstage and Rick made some joke like, oh, it's, it's the guy from the Illinois Exaggerator. And Ken was like, yeah, I exaggerated your career into what it is, But
they played the Night Gallery, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing this right, Waukegan, Illinois.
Yeah. And that
is like 6 a.m.
And that's the site of Cheap Trick's videos when they lip sync from their first album. That's where they filmed those Night Gallery videos. So even as late as 79, when you see them on Japanese TV and they show them, playing, they were filmed there. Yeah, no, Ken Adamany and Bunn are quoted in Brian's book. And when I started, I did get in touch with Bunn only through Facebook. And, I asked him, if he would answer all these questions at Budokan. And he said, well, I don't, what's the book about? And I said, and his exact words were like, I don't think I really want to do another book where I have to refute all these stories of my bandmates. So it's like, okay. And then like a day later, I just asked him a question about, and he basically just answered every question. So his only, condition was, you can say Carlos confirms or whatever. And he wrote a very nice, post once the book came out. And then Ken, like I said, Brian will argue, and he's probably right, that he kind of softened up Ken Adamany, because Ken Adamany, is in his 80s now, but I know he was a tough dude. Wasn't quite Colonel Tom Parker, but he definitely was. He didn't take any shit. I know that, and he was very determined to get this band heard, to make sure that people knew about them. And he also, like I said, once I think he kind of saw that, I came in peace and that I was just interested. And I think he had said he liked kind of my writing style, which I think is definitely different than any of the other guys who are on Cheap Trick. That I thought was important. Obviously, you can just tell talking to me, there's obviously a lot of pop culture that's literally around me in this room, but just that are always kind of like attaching to things. And so he was very helpful. Like I said, he has, everything. Like I said, phone logs, appointment cards, passes, the list of equipment that Bun and Rick wanted for the John Lennon session. Bun is a huge Ludwig drum fan, much like Ringo Starr. And that was something I put in the book also. I know Brian did too. Just the amount of blue collar or even, well, not blue collar, just the jobs, the descriptions of Buddy Carlos I thought were hilarious. Like I included a lot of them, again, guy that, your teacher, guy that works in the accounting department, night manager at a convenience store. It was amazing.
Right.
They were usually insinuating who's fat. They were usually insinuating who's balding. And obviously they made a combat his smoking. There were a couple, that were like Nazi on the run in South America, which, I would have put in, and people were like, do you sure want to put it in? I'm like, well, I'm Jewish. I don't think they really thought Buddy Carlos was like in the boys from Brazil. They made it pretty clear they were just joking to hit a mustache. I understand at the time, and I'm well aware of the, I have relatives, obviously, who was in Europe. I don't think that be taken that way. But yeah, so they were extremely helpful with the book, confirming stuff as much as they could.
Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
Come out wherever you are.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. What's your perfect night? Maybe you're settled at home alone or with loved ones, covered in blankets, about to watch your favorite show. It's cozy, it's calm, and you're ready for a perfect night in. Therapy can feel a bit like that, a place for comfort, a time when you replenish your energy and take care of yourself. And hey, you can even do it without leaving that same cozy couch. This season is the perfect time to give therapy a try, right from the comfort of home. With BetterHelp, get matched with a tailored therapist based on your needs and preferences entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find comfort this season with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Marcos, who's loving his journey with Noom GLP-1.
I'm getting to where I want to be. I'm in such a good place right now, and I'm very confident that I'm going to be able to continue this weight loss, this journey, and really make a true lifestyle change.
Don't believe it? Take it from Cam, who's gaining more confidence with Noom GLP-1.
I really am starting to feel better. Like, I feel a lot lighter. I feel a lot happier. I feel a lot more confident. I just feel a lot more like myself. I don't feel so bogged down every day.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom Smart. Noom, the smart way to lose weight. Get started with Noom GLP-1 at Noom.com. That's Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
There's a story told that famous Aerosmith producer Jack Douglas discovered the band in the back of a bowling alley. Talk about the myth and the real story behind how they signed to Epic Records. Also, there's the story of Bunny breaking his arm, I think, on that same night, or is part of that story.
Well, so Bunny Carlos did break his arm in 1976 on a light pack dimmer that was made for them. Brian wrote the exact show, but he did. He had to wear a cast. Ken Adamany got a call in the middle of the night from Rick, and this was just as they were about to kind of cement their record deal. So this was, hugely catastrophic. And he thought, of course, Rick was joking, because Rick, of course, generally is joking. especially in the mid 70s, I'm sure. He was, in character 24/7, kind of like, Don Rickles. So what they did was they played, and Bun essentially played with a cast. There is a couple pictures of some of the Cheap Trick groups where you can see it, and they might have used it, Bun and Steve, for one of their Bunny's bootlegs, because they released one from the Orange Monkey in Rochester, where I went to college, of Bun playing. So Bun's kind of like not the Bunny Carlos that you associate with the Power. And then Hank Ransom, I believe I'm pronouncing it right, who is a friend of theirs from one of the early permutations. I know, Brian would know, whether it be Naz or Fuse, but he was a friend of theirs from Philly, whose daughter, coincidentally, at least according to what Brian wrote, was the person who saw their parents getting it on the couch, which made its way into Surrender. He played drums with them. And so Bun had told the story when they got into the Hall of Fame, when at that point, I think a lot of Dirty Laundry from Cheap Trick was coming out, because they were doing all these interviews, and obviously they had been playing since 2010 with just Dax without Bun. Bun had to sue for his quarter share back. So Bun told the story that Rick and Tom kind of wanted to go, was it Rick and Tom? Yeah, they wanted to go forward with two drummers, and Bum was like, absolutely fucking not. And he stood up for that. And obviously Buddy Carlos stayed the drummer of Cheap Trick. And then the early part about Jack, yeah, Jack did not discover them in a bowling alley. He, like I told you off the air, I think he's very protective of that story. I mean, I put in the book even some of the stories, and Tom, in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction speech, called him Sir Jack Douglas, and said for discovering them. I mean, he discovered them in the larger sense, that his involvement with the first Cheap Trick album absolutely got them signed to Epic, 100%. Like, okay. Jack Douglas, I mean, it makes him no less important to the story. But they were actively trying to get a record deal. They would have preferred John Lennon to actually, produce their album. I mean, they couldn't get to John Lennon. Jack obviously was huge with Aerosmith. It's funny, his style of producing, obviously, it's to leave the rough edges in.
Those early Aerosmith records are
rocks. I included a quote that actually he put that was from a cigar magazine, where he talked about something he learned from John was, to make things loud. And that way, like, if there's mistakes in there, it seems like they're intentional. The exact date of the Sunset Bowl show, I put it in the book. Jack flew out, heard them. Doug Broad's book talks about it. I mean, literally, Jack showed up with a stopwatch to kind of time them. And I think Ken Animan, he said, like, you're not going to need that. Jack loved them. I've seen, the phone logs. Jack was working with Aerosmith to the Copley Hotel in Boston, like talking to Jack. I've seen the cover letter that invited Jack. I've seen the limo bills for, Jack getting picked up. So again, I get it that, who the hell am I to question Jack Douglas or anybody? But anytime this story is debunked, he seems to get a little defensive, which is weird, because again, he's Jack Douglas, and I don't think his resume needs this. But again, they invite him to the Sunset Bowl. That night, essentially they got a deal to work with Jack Douglas, which absolutely is what led to them being signed to Epic, which absolutely led to them having a Max's Kansas City showcase where Gene and Paul show up, which absolutely led to them picking the songs they did for the first album, which were harder edged in production, but also the more socio-political quirkiness, whether it be He's a Whore or Daddy Should Have Stayed in High School. And there are people, Brian's book gets into it, whether it be, side A or side B or that to Hot Love, that to them, that is the best Cheap Trick album. And it's definitely almost an outlier in how raw it is. But he wasn't signed for another album, and Tom Werman was on staff. He wasn't assigned to work with Cheap Trick, but that's how he became the producer for Cheap Trick. And obviously, again, another Cheap Trick contradiction and blessing and curse scenario was that Tom Werman is now attached to their three biggest commercial albums. We talked about, the songs Mike Damone would cite. So you have, obviously, In Color, I Want You to Want Me is on there, although a very different version. You have, obviously, Heaven Tonight, opening track is Surrender, and you have Dream Police. And obviously, Dream Police is that third song that they played at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that everybody knows them for. So that's how Tom came on there. But yeah, to answer your question, Bun broke his arm, that's true. And Jack didn't discover them. And which, again, it like I said, I don't understand why, because, I mean, Jack is obviously a hugely important character in music history. I just saw him in the Beatles 64 documentary. There was Apple's thing on Lennon's assassination. I mean, just on Aerosmith alone, he's a Hall of Fame producer. They worked with him again in the mid-'80s on Standing on the Edge. His work on Budokan, Jack Douglas, is I wanted to make sure that was given proper, because he helped salvage those tapes. I mean, the Budokan album that everybody hears, I do have an audience copy of The Second Night, and I'm actually getting from somebody who bought it overseas, a copy of the first. I mean, the screaming is not manufactured. It definitely is mixed in a way that it is, as Jax had said, you want to feel like you're in the room. And the room was crazy, both Osaka and the 2 nights of Budokan. His way of salvaging those tapes, he came up with a way of like gating Blunt's drum signal because the drum didn't come out right. Tom's bass had to be recorded. Rick did want to do some of the solos over, which again goes against the myth of it being 100% live. I mean, the shows were awesome and those were live, but I mean, there were things that were done to them. It wasn't really the sweetening that they would kind of resent, like when they would talk about in color. Obviously, they would suggest that Tom had kind of, and you had him on, so you know this. I mean, they suggested that Tom did this without them knowing, or did it with, and I can tell you, not knowing the inner workings of the band, Rick Nielsen would never have allowed anything to be done without his knowing.
That's the I want you to want me story. I remember
have
Tom
a theory.
saying,
I have a theory on that I told, and I put in the book. I think personally that number one, In Color, unlike the first album, has some of the most amazing material that Cheap Trick did. Remember, I mean, Rick had recorded, or they had done demos, or he had written most of the songs that appear in the first 3 albums. So they have this incredible batch of songs to choose from. Jack chose the edgier, it's recorded in New York, the first album, edgier material, and produced it in a much more raw way. Then they have In Color, where they kind of that didn't hit. I mean, nobody listened to the first album. It was, it was given, obviously, Ira Robbins loved it, and some people would gave it good reviews, but it wasn't selling anything for Epic. So they went the other way, and they go to California and they record, with Werman, and they pick much more palatable, pop-friendly songs. And obviously, you could argue on Budokan that, I mean, we can run through the track list, that all of those songs are some of their best material in terms of appeal. Tom was the guy to get them on the radio. That's what he said. That's how it's in his book, and that's what he said to me when we spoke. He thought that was his job, to make them palatable for radio listeners. So,
what were the songs from the first album that Jack didn't want on and Tom wanted to use for the next album?
I mean, I Want You to Want Me and Surrender existed.
Surrender, yeah.
Right. I mean, so yeah, again, I don't think Jack, again, a Rick story that he would always say is that, we had these songs, I Want You to Want Me, Surrender, and including Dream Police, which did not exist in the form we know it in 1977. I mean, Rick knew he wanted a song called Dream Police. They had some of the riffs worked out, but it wasn't like, I think it became, especially when Cheap Trick was frustrated, including when they hit with Budokan, Rick would say things, and obviously in the case of Tom, and Tom also is not a stranger to having this, obviously Stay Hungry was re-recorded without him, Dee Snider. I mean, several artists have had this thing with him, but I think it wasn't, Jack didn't say, don't put it on there. They did know I Want You to Want Me was a great song. That's another Cheap Trick myth. They were almost signed to Mercury Records, Robin McBride, I believe, on the strength of that song. They knew that song was a hit, but Jack, the album he put out there, I mean, even, Oh Candy, which is the most kind of commercial, that was the single on the first album, is a song about Marshall Mintz being a heroin addict and hanging himself. I mean, it's packaged, it's very Cheap Trick, it's packaged in a loud, poppy hook. But I mean, obviously the lyrics, Oh Candy, why did you do it? You didn't have to stick a needle in your arm. I mean, I'm sure people weren't listening to that. So I Want You to Want Me was available to choose from, I guess. So it didn't make it on the album. It's on the second album. And then your interview with Tom is exactly what I have seen Tom Werman talk about.
Right. He said Rick was like, hey, you're the producer.
Right. And he's very careful with how he says it, because I can tell you, having spoken to Tom, obviously in a phone interview, he's hurt by that, because he had openly said Cheap Trick was the best band he'd worked with, that he had the most fun with them. Thankfully,
Rick was friends with the family.
Right.
Their families.
Trick-or-treating story I've heard. I mean, obviously Rick is in many ways the musical force of Cheap Trick. So, Tom loves music, and he's also a hell of a writer, I will say, because when I saw his book, I actually emailed him, and I was like, did you have a ghostwriter on that? He's like, no. I'm like, you did a really good job.
Yep.
I mean, who am I to tell that to him? But I'm not so accomplished. But I thought he did a great job. But he's hurt, and he talked about, he still has Auf Wiedersehen from Heaven Tonight, I assume it's the studio version, not the Budokan version, on his playlist for when he works out. Like, which, again, I can't imagine he hears Cheap Trick, because he was also getting asked a lot, which we can get to, in the 90s when the Steve Albini version came. I mean, again, In Color becomes this thing where I think it's the frustration of, we went one way, it didn't work. Here's another way, and it didn't work. And then the song that is the most different from what it became. And Tom said they changed it. I mean, they were playing it largely the way you hear it on Budokan when they played it live in '77. It's just that version that exists. It wasn't like they were working up the song. And so I do not think he put the tack piano without them knowing it. I don't think he did the finger snaps without them knowing it. Bun had said in a different interview, he didn't say it to me, but it was a quoted interview. We knew what, they were doing. We just thought it was dopey, and it didn't work. So, and another Cheap Trick contradiction, all of those songs, Clock Strikes 10, Southern Girls, but I Want You to Want Me, it's the part that they don't like. It's the crying, 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 cheesy echo that those Japanese girls love and ultimately will be screaming back at them on April 27th, April 28th, April 30th, 1978, that will basically make Cheap Trick, I don't know if it's a household name, but that's the thing. It's still, I mean, you cannot hear I Want You to Want Me from Budokan. And, the building of them, first kind of murmuring, crying, 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 and then, them shouting it, that powers the song, the energy. And I know when people heard it for the first time, or I heard it, you're like, who the hell is this band that is absolutely commanding this insane, screaming Japanese audience? It's like the Beatles.
Those screams are real.
Yes,
so those
screams real.
There's
screams
nothing
real.
enhanced.
Right. And Bun has said that he even had his own audience tapes because he's a taper, so he could send them back to his family and be like, see how big we are here?
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this. I wanted to ask you about how they became so big in Japan too. That's
another interesting story. They became so big in Japan, and again,
bands like Kiss and Queen, they
sure.
love those bands,
Right.
the performance bands, right? That was
right. So that becomes another famously told Rick story. Again, you could argue. I was talking about it with Don McLeese, who was one of those guys who owned a record shop in the '70s and used to report on them. And he asked me, he's like, "Do you think that Cheap Trick is the origin of being big in Japan?" We joke about it in Spinal Tap, but I do. They really are. They're big in Japan, but what that also means, of course, that is a little Spinal Tap, is they were really big compared to how not big they were here. Because something to remember, of course, is that Rick has said, they get on that plane and come back, and he still has to take out the garbage. I made the joke, it's like Henry Hill, with the egg noodles and the ketchup. He's a regular schnook. They got so big in Japan really because Lois Marino, who's since passed away, this is something I didn't put so much in the book because Ken Anameni had been sending me some of her early letters. There were a couple Japanese magazines, Angaku Senka and Music Life. They were huge in Japan, and they were filled with pictures. They look very much like the Budokan album art, was taken kind of from that. Ohasebi, I'm sure not pronouncing it right, was the photographer who also took pictures of the Beatles. So the Runaways, of course, had a Japanese album, but of course, the girls in Japan either weren't liberated enough or badass enough to kind of gravitate to the Runaways. Kiss was, of course, big in Japan and played Budokan, but it was Music Life, the actual, where Rick has told the story many times. Kiss, Queen, Japanese press, they liked us, asked me to write an account of what life was like with Queen. That's how it happened, which is true, but they did ask him. Obviously, Cheap Trick was getting a lot of mail from CBS. Again, somehow In Color, became a huge hit over there, maybe somewhat because of Tom's pop sound. They loved, like I said, Clock Strike 10 was a huge song. I Want You to Want Me, and they loved the softened version of it. Crazy thing about Cheap Trick is I mentioned how I got into them. They would also turn around and play Surrender, I Want You to Want Me. I Want You to Want Me is a little, more poppy, and then play Off Wiedersehen, where, they're screaming sayonara, suicide. But I never got to see, and I'm sure Ken has, it, I saw the cover letter from Rick that said, this is my take. I'm not much of a writer. He has said in many interviews, they asked me to write about time with Queen because they did open for Queen in January of '77.
That was the last minute decision.
Last minute decision
open for Queen.
Yes. Okay. And I love to, it's probably not commercially the smartest thing, but I love to give credit to everything I read. Brian Crampton put in the book that, Thin Lizzy was scheduled to open those dates. Somebody in Thin Lizzy, I should know off the top of my head, got in a fight. So Ken was able to get them on the bill to open for Queen. That was huge. And again, they loved Queen. Cheap Trick did. Like they saw with Kiss, they separated themselves from them, thinking that Queen was great musically, but a little more image-oriented, a little more shticky. I know it's hard for people to imagine that Cheap Trick would see anything as shticky, but
visual.
Yeah,
as
again,
visual as the sound.
and as we'll get to, and again, it was on the exhibit Rick's Picks in the Burpee Museum in Wisconsin, and Brian also put it in the book, and Ken has confirmed they have it. I mean, the original lyrics to Surrender are not "Got My Kiss" records out; they were "Got My Queen" records out, which people, again, obviously Gene Simmons has gotten a lot of mileage out of saying that it's a tribute to them, and Kiss is a huge part of the Cheap Trick story, 100%. Kind of like I said with Jag, that isn't exactly what happened. I don't know if some people care, but it could have been another band. It just happened to be, and Cheap Trick has leaned into it. I mean, since Alive 2 was released, they've been throwing out Kiss records, so it's not exactly like Born in the USA was a misunderstood song and album, and he didn't like Ronald Reagan using it, but Bruce was also super bulked up in the age of Rambo, playing in front of American flag. I Love Skynyrd, they didn't like being classified as a redneck band, but they also let MCA put them out there with the Confederate flag behind them. So Cheap Trick has leaned into it as well. But Rick,
but it was Queen, and then they changed it to Kiss. Why?
I think it was just random. It might have
just random.
Yeah, and that, of course, again, what would that song have become? I think it's still a fantastic song. If Queen was in there, I think, again, they
either one, both bands, they stood the test of time. If it was like an obscure band or a band that was famous then.
Right. I mean, Cheap Trick's favorite band arguably was The Move, which is a perfect Cheap Trick thing because The Move were so Beatles tinged, but it was like second generation Beatles. They loved Roy Wood, and obviously they covered California.
Pre-ELO.
Yeah. So they
imagine if they said, "Yeah, I got my Move records out." Yeah, nowadays, people would listen and say, "No, who's the Move?"
Right, and again, like everything else, Cheap Trick, it worked out perfectly because we can talk about this. They get on the Logon tour. They obviously opened for Kiss, so that becomes a part of the story. But they did write the articles, so they start to appear in these magazines in Japan that are just, again, very glossy. Obviously, Robin looking like obviously completely. I made the reference in the book, like Derek Zoolander, like he was really, really, really good looking. And Tom, and so that appealed to these girls, and I think CBS was able to build off of that. I mean, the decision to record the shows, I think was a lot later in the game than people realized. I had seen recently a letter from Los Marino up until April, which is when they played the Japanese shows because they went to Europe first. They were still kind of figuring it out. It really wasn't meant to be released here. The album was just going to be a souvenir for the Japanese fans. That's why the songs that were on there were Clock Strikes 10, Obviously I Want You to Want Me, songs that even they played it differently, that they knew that they would like. The hall was obviously loud. I know the Budokan wasn't really, even though the Beatles played there, I mentioned it, wasn't really made for concerts. Obviously, it was meant for sumo wrestling. They played other shows. I've heard an audience copy of the 25th. There is no copy of the May 1st show that they played, the last show, but they were able to get the hype going. I will say nothing I've ever heard, read, seen suggests that they weren't genuinely shocked by the reception they got. Every story that they've told about, being on the plane, why are all those people out there? Is there some president of some country on there? It can't be for us. I've never heard anything to dispute that. The mob scenes, people trying to cut a piece of Robin's hair, all that stuff I've heard is true.
And again, come back to the States,
right?
And it's a whole different world.
And then also it fucked with their heads. I know I interviewed them for the box set that became Sex America Cheap Trick, and then the whole interviews, and I give full credit, were a major source because the interviews themselves that were for that box set, Ira wrote in his book, Music in a Word, Volume 2. Obviously, Ira's a huge Who fan and a huge Cheap Trick fan and a huge Clash fan also. He mentioned that those interviews were done at a time where they were parting ways with Ken. They definitely were more honest than usual. They definitely felt like people that, because they spoke very badly of people once they didn't have to work with them. Rick had always said stuff like that. Like, we're not going to badmouth, Tom Werman, and they did a little bit like when we're working with him, or badmouth this producer or that producer. Later on, they would have no problem doing that. But yeah, it messed with their heads because when Budokan became the thing, they were like, why this? And again, they had been playing those songs, a lot of them, since like 1975. So they were kind of sick of it. Again, I mean, the stories of what went on when they were in Japan, Bun has alluded to like some of the road crew and maybe hooking up with girls. I made it very clear that, women, not underage girls, because you have to clarify that. Rick has said, I used a chapter of Jeb Wright's book about interviews that he had done. Rick said, yeah, we did leave the hotel. Like, of course, if someone tells you not to go out, but they was really just to go to dinners and stuff or to go to restaurants. The famous cover story that Sam McLean did for Rolling Stone. Some of those interviews were conducted of them having like Sapporo beer in a restaurant, but they were obviously huge. And yeah, people were mobbing their hotel rooms. One of the interesting things about the fallout of Cheap Trick in 2010 or so is that Bun and Robin, I guess the people in Cheap Trick that you would least associate image-wise, they shared a room in Japan. And Tom and Rick, who again are best friends, they shared a room. So in the induction speech, for instance, when Robin says Bun, I mean, they were not on good terms, and I don't think they still are, even though Bun does attend Robin Taylor Xander's shows occasionally, which is a pretty big move, I will say. Because I do not think Robin Xander would attend a Bunny Carlos, performance in Madison when he plays. When Robin said, Bun, it's your turn to change the channel, I think that was a reference to their time together. I mean, when they got back from Japan, eventually, I don't think they stayed in 4 separate rooms, but I don't know if they had to be roommates per se. On the Kiss tour, they were driving around in a motorhome. But it really, messed with their heads. Tom Peterson has said they didn't actually see the Budokan really until later because they were basically smuggled in mail trucks to play the shows. There were 2. 3 of them were recorded. One's in Osaka. That was another Jack Douglas thing that is not true. That I know he had done a Budokan podcast with Rick as a surprise guest. Corey Taylor of Slipknot is a huge Cheap Trick fan. Linda Perry of Four Non Blondes, who is also a huge Cheap Trick fan. And Jack had said the album isn't really recorded at Budokan; it's recorded in Osaka on the 27th. Which he said, well, the legend is really Budokan. Like Cheap Trick Osaka doesn't sound good, which reminded me of the famous Springsteen story, that Bruce had said to Little Steven, like the E Street Band, that's the legend, But Bun had said, that basically all 3 nights were used, that Jack never listened to all the recordings. But his point about Budokan being cloaked in myth and legend and, some things that are not true, that part I think is true. And again, most famously, that they weren't going to play I Want You to Want Me to the last minute. That isn't a true story. I mean, they played it the show before. The cover of my book is a picture of them outside the London Roundhouse, April 2nd, 1978, which was the last show they played before Budokan. They played I Want You to Want Me. It's in the, I think, the New Musical Express review. They played it on TV for the old Grey Whistle test. And I saw Ken had the letter that they wrote to the promoters, like, these are the songs we're considering playing. And it was on there, So the idea that the heavens parted and the big man walked through a bar and there was light shining on him, I mean, I love it. So I think the myths exist because just the truth is so fantastic. I also put in the book, the famous line from the man who shot Liberty Valance, print the legend. Like, that's always been a Cheap Trick thing from the band has no past bio. And they continue to tell that story. I mean, Robin, as recently as 2014, he reunited with Brian Beebe. Originally, he was in a folk duo with Brian Beebe, who has since passed away. They basically played together. And, he's told that story. Or Tom Peterson has said, we needed a song at the last second, and the promoter, wanted us to, like, kind of flesh out the set. And so we added it in. And again, I think the story exists because the idea that this song would break them is too fantastic, right? So they did know that it was going to be a hit. They did allow Jack to put the finger snaps and the crying. But the actual reality of them playing it on stage, I mean, by the time the Budokan's recorded, I've heard on the 25th, you can hear the fans are freaking out. So when you see the video of them on the 28th, when they say crying, Rick has his hands up and Robin does too. So they know they're going to get a response. Now, they've now played the song a couple times, but it makes it no less crazy and just amazing that this is going to change everything for them.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
We'll be back with the Magic Tunes for the Armada Room's 2-hour disco swing party after this short break. Till then, don't you go changing.
I was able to interview somebody for the book who's a graphic artist now, big Cheap Trick fan, who was at both of those shows. Because that was another thing that I wanted to do, was maybe talk to people that were there. Was it as crazy as? But nothing I've ever researched suggests that it was any more of a surprise. When they got back, when Ken Animani and Jim Charn, who's also a huge help in my book, who was the Epic product manager, when they heard the tapes, even with all the sonic flaws, when they played them, I think, for Jonathan Little at a WISM in Madison, they realized they had something. I mean, they realized the hook of that record was these screaming Japanese girls. But I also understand for a band, I don't even say like Cheap Trick, because I don't know there is a band like Cheap Trick, but for Cheap Trick, that seemed a little, is reductive the right word? I mean, it seemed like too much of a gimmick because they'd done so many other things. And they were a band that wanted to be successful. They were grinding every night, That is the Cheap Trick way. They did want to become successful. They did get frustrated. Rick is a super proficient guitar player, but obviously his guitar faces that he talked about and his acting like he wasn't, I use again in the book the famous line from Singles that Kira Sedgwick says to Campbell Scott, I think you're not having an act is your act. Which is Cameron Crowe. And I think
also live albums were big, though. That was the other thing. The timing was right because Kiss Alive and Frampton's live
album. Gonzo by Nugent,
Right. So this was a period where if you're going to do it, let's do it.
Right.
Now.
And as they had said at the time, and they maintained it, they were against the release of this record because they figured they didn't have enough hits to have a greatest hits album. And that's what a live album was, the greatest hits album. So when they get back, they're right back on the road promoting Now Heaven Tonight. Japan is in the rearview mirror. And again, I'm sure, like I said, it fucked with their confidence because, they were gods literally there. And now they come here and they're not headlining. They famously open for anybody. But then, they were famously opening for Kansas, Santana, the Kinks, Starcastle. I mean, they opened for everybody in 1977, 78. And then, they're mixing this album, while they're touring every single night. And I think that's also a big part of the Cheap Trick story is that, they're grinding every single night on the road while all this is happening. So, they record Heaven Tonight, again, with Tom Werman. Rick is listening to the mixes, like, from a payphone before they go to Europe. I saw the facts. I mean, they are huge Move fans, and I fully admit that had I been alive, well, I was alive, but if I had been a music fan alive in that respect, in like 1975, I would not have known the Move, but like Carrie Baker sure as hell did. Ira Robbins definitely did. They got the little like Easter eggs, the Cheap Trick, and that was a big thing. Like we're gonna put that in there, kind of like the Beastie Boys sampling, like see if people get it. It always felt like Cheap Trick was kind of fucking with you. Were they making fun of you? Were you in on the joke? And then again, I mentioned being Deadhead. They were this cult band that people that got them love them. So they get back and they're promoting Heaven Tonight. Surrender is obviously an amazing all-time song. It's the opening track on Heaven Tonight. It's not breaking. They're mixing sort of Budokan. I put in the book the days that they were, trying to fix it, the record plant. Jack comes up with a way to revive Bun's drums, which didn't come out well on their tapes. And I've heard audience tapes. So the raw tapes, they literally set up his drum kit in the studio and had like a gating sound, like a signal that actually would like go into the drums. It wasn't like a slipshod job because they were still playing every night, but they had to bring in numerous people. And, they got it out by October of 78. Jim Charn mentioned the From Tokyo to You that Cheap Trick collectors have, the original FM promo album that doesn't have any of the art on it. That was released to radio stations. And then another segment of the story is...
Did it come out in Japan first, then the U.S.?
It came out in Japan at the same time, I believe, that it was starting to be imported. It was a legal import. I put in the book Marty Scott of Gem Records, who that's an element of the story that wasn't told much. That was something I learned through Wikipedia, that Gem, imports were obviously a different animal back then. They were legal, and obviously they're expensive, and you had to really work to get them, the way people talk about vinyl, or back in the day when I used to have to trade, dead tapes through the mail. They made a deal to import the album legally. And so it said Gem, I had a big yellow sticker on it. It was showing up in import stores, legally, but it wasn't making Cheap Trick a ton of money. They weren't getting a very big share of it. And so, again, blessing and a curse, the album is starting to spread. And you can hear in bootlegs, audience bootlegs from that time. Rick is mentioning it from the stage. We're going to do Need Your Love, which is on a Japanese album, which I hear is really hard to get in this town, hold for applause. So it's starting to build that way. And then by February of 79, that's when it comes out worldwide domestically, which ends all of the import trade. And, it becomes now the thing. So it was legally imported into the US, but it was also being sold everywhere else. So, for instance, and talk about not politically correct, it was sold on yellow. It was marketed as yellow kamikaze vinyl, which that's what it was called. It was sold in England that way. So some people have those copies. I think it was the New Musical Express had a whole like parody ad. It was like the Daily Horror and had Bunny Carlos on it. And, again, and when Kiss played in Japan, they did every single review of anything Japanese included like references to the atomic bomb or to a tsunami or a typhoon. It was obviously very, beyond on PC. A little weird thing that I noticed watching the Budokan videos, you could see during Hello There that Rick, of course, was doing all these different faces, does like a kind of like a squinty-eyed face, like at the front. I was like, oh, that couldn't have aged well, but nobody would notice that because he did a million other faces. I mean, I think somebody who was disabled would probably notice that like vacant stare he did or he looked off probably didn't seem very complimentary. But it was sold pretty much everywhere but domestically. So it was Gem Records. Marty Scott was very nice to talk to me. I mean, he was pretty adamant in the interviews I'd seen him conduct. He felt that Epic didn't know what they had, that they allowed him to legally import Budokan because they didn't see the genius of it. They were all focused on Dream Police. I think what I got from Jim Charn and Ken is that this was a way to kind of seed the market. They did not anticipate it becoming a worldwide phenomenon and becoming the thing that everybody knows them for, and it becoming, platinum album. That they didn't see. But they knew they had something on the tapes. They put it out kind of to test things. It acquired its own kind of like hard to get mojo as a result of the import shops. Steve West of Danger told a great story about going and it being hard to get the Japanese vinyl, like literally like holding in your hand, like it was like heavy vinyl, and that made it just like even cooler. The pictures on there, they talked about they don't like the cover because Robin and Tom kind of look short. The way the cover is shot, which of course is a continuation of what they did on Heaven Tonight, and in color, was to have the two hot guys on the front and the two dorky guys on the back. But in that cover, the way it's shot, like there's a scarf coming off of Tom's mic stand, which makes it look like Robin's almost like in a weird Mr. Furley leisure suit kind of thing.
A Three's Company reference. I like that. Gotta get one in.
Either that or at Larry Dallas. I could have worked that in there. But so it was coming out everywhere, and then by February '79 they officially released Budokan. The only problem is that, and another blessing curse thing is they pretty much have recorded Dream Police by the end of 1978 with Tom Werman, so everything Dream Police related gets held up. So the album is essentially finished. They would say it was in the can. In fact, they were recording, a Kiss connection. They were recording the studio version of Need Your Love, which appears on Budokan. Some people think maybe they didn't need to put it on Dream Police because obviously everybody had heard the live version. They did it all in one take, and Bunn has said that they all wanted to see Phantom of the Park on TV that night live. So they just did it real kind of like quickly. And so they didn't really, I mean, it's a long song to begin with. But then it gets held up, and now, they're returning. In February '79, they're playing in Europe. They're playing with a lot of their musical idols, Roy Wood, Dave Edmunds, Cozy Powell. They're on these tour where they're, all over the place. They're on Rock Goes to College. And then, they also play Japan, where now they're coming back for the second time, and they're able to at least play some of the Dream Police stuff. They play, I think, Writing on the Wall. I think they show the Voices video, if I'm not mistaken, or the Dream Police video. They don't actually play the song.
One of my favorites from Cheap Trick, by the way. Yeah. Voices.
And then they come back here, and nobody's interested in that. Now, Dream Police is ultimately going to become the follow-up to Budokan, which it was never intended to be. That's the problem, is that, for all of the love of Dream Police, the song and Voices and the album itself, it kind of gets, everything Dream Police gets nixed because of Budokan. And now throughout 1979, when they appear on the cover of Rolling Stone, when they are everywhere, but they're basically covering an album of songs they've been playing since, a lot of them since 1975, that they never intended to do. And you can even see in the set list, they're playing I Want You to Want Me and Surrender consecutively. They're playing Lookout, which was an outtake from the first album, great song that happened to appear on Budokan, only on Budokan because the record company did want new songs. So to Epic Japan, that was a new song, Sunny Japan. So they put it on there, but it wasn't a new song to them. But they were even playing that in sets in '79. So they were really covering their live album.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
You must not see anybody or talk to anybody. Anything you do could have serious repercussions on future events.
There were several moments where I think Epic was going to release Dream Police, then they held it back. So by the time it finally gets released in the fall of '79, September 21st, I know Rick had said to David Frick, who was then a writer for Circus, that no matter what it was never going to meet expectations because it had just, much like Budokan, had got this mojo from being hard to find and kind of, DIY, and people would, it was cool to have it, and it was in record shops. Dream Police became this thing, and I think as great as it was, it couldn't meet those expectations. So, of course, There's some backlash in the reviews that I include, were they trying to be this highfalutin concept album? What are the Dream Police? They were in costumes. We talked about the Sergeant Pepper movie. I think there was somebody in one of the, I don't know, like SUNY Cobleskill or one of the college newspapers that I was reading a review on that said, like, who the hell wears like outfits? Like, unless you're, Sergeant Pepper, like that's not going to work. I think it really messed with them. And I don't think they loved necessarily at that point their time with Warren Mann, although he correctly has pointed out, like, look, you make fun of me for softening, I want you to want me, but then you put strings on Dream Police. So which is it? Am I like, am I neutering your sound? Or am I, the guy that stood in the way? I mean, Rick has said, well, I knew what I was doing and I was proven right. And the other thing I will say, and Tom didn't mention it, but I did research it, and I do not think this was Tom's doing, but he also was credited for producing on Budokan, which he had nothing to do with. He was offered to go to Budokan. He had, I think, he was either working with Ted Nugent or was going to Key West to work with Ted Nugent. He passed on it, but he's certainly not foolish for passing on the trip because nobody knew what it was going to be. But he was receiving money, and I know that didn't probably sit well with them. They eventually had to sue to get that money back. I don't think that he was, it wasn't like he wasn't Madoffing their money or anything. But he was receiving a producer credit financially. On the album, it just says produced by Cheap Trick, a Budokan record. He did produce, obviously, Dream Police. But I think that also is a big thing that kind of leads to Cheap Trick not being nearly as ready for the 80s as you'd think, because they've run through a lot of their best early songs, although I like a lot of the songs on Dream Police. You'd think they're well suited for the decade that is coming because they are visual. Yes, they have videos everybody remembers, She's Tight or Don't Be Cruel or even Up the Creek, but cracks are starting to show. They're going to find a new producer. They are already talking in some of the reviews I'd read of the shows in New Zealand and Australia, like, they're going to look for a new producer, which they had done before. I believe they did reach out to Jeff Lynne at one point to see if he would produce one of their albums, and then again, I don't know,
that would have been interesting.
Yeah. I mean, they worked with everybody else, right? George Martin, Todd Rundgren, Roy Thomas Baker, again with Jack Douglas, Ted Templeman. So they worked with every producer. But I think that led a lot to the kind of the halting of Cheap Trick, because as much as it is a myth that they came out of nowhere, it's a myth that they didn't want to be successful. It's a myth that the song that launched them was a happy accident. It's also a myth that they didn't deserve it. They were working their ass off for so long. And a lot of they wanted longevity. And we talked about it. I mean, even the Stones obviously had periods where they couldn't stand each other. And no one's going to look at Dirty Work and say that was a great album. Bruce, I mean, my first Bruce show was on the Lucky Town Human Touch tour. But would Bruce have ever gotten to Wrecking Ball, had he kept the E Street Band intact through the 90s? I don't know. But certainly, so who can establish 50 years of not, no pun intended, flaming out? So, when Cheap Trick gets to, 1979, 1980, and I mentioned the book, Doug Brode did too, they headlined the Garden, May 12th, 1980. They have a great relationship with New York. Ira Robbins obviously was one of their original fans. They were fascinated by the fact that New York would like them. They're huge. They play the Garden. I have a picture in there from Bill O'Leary of Robin and Rick. And then by August, Tom's out of band. Another
wouldn't return until 1988. 87.
He did actually play with them in March of 87. Ken Anime confirmed that out in Rockford. His first appearance with Cheap Trick. He played with them. They jokingly said afterwards that they might not be able to call themselves Cheap Trick because obviously John Brandt was in the band, and I don't know what the legalities. So they joked like we're going to become a law firm, like that. We'll be like Xander, Peterson, Nielsen, and Carlos. But Tom played with them. I know this is exhausting to say, but it's true. Another Cheap Trick story was, we were at Julian Lennon's birthday party. We spilled a drink on Tom's lap. If you read how did Tom Peterson get back into Cheap Trick, this is the story they tell. I mean, even Ira in his interview was like, that story has always seemed a little bit too convenient, which is the same for all of these stories. I know I listened to an interview with Robin that was conducted in Japan that's on YouTube where he had said, again, when you're writing about Cheap Trick, or anybody who's an obsessive Cheap Trick fan, when you hear something that's different or new or a nugget, it's the same thing I am with the Dead. Like if I see a picture, I haven't seen that. Was that from Ron Rackow's archives? I've never seen that shot, of Mountain Girl and Jerry. He mentioned that he would reached out to Tom. They played together in March of 87. Tom appears on stage. I think it's in San Capistrano. I was listening to the bootleg on the 27th and the 28th. They're playing the Coach House. So then he comes back to the band. They stayed on good terms with John Brandt. I assume it was a little bit like the way that, after Kiss Unplugged, the way that Gene and Paul were kind of like, okay, we're getting the original band back together, which of course does not become a cliche term. And then, Tom becomes obviously another member of Cheap Trick, and the original four are back, and yet another Cheap Trick blessing curse. They hit with The Flame, which is not their song. I mean, I still don't like The Flame. I know people who love The Flame. They've made it their own. The solo's great. I don't know if we constitute that as a power ballad or not. It is certainly not the Cheap Trick that people remembered from the 70s, and it's certainly not the Cheap Trick people remember from the Jack Douglas album. I mean, it could not be farther.
Who wrote it?
Not Diane Warren. No, it's somebody else, because I actually had to change in the book. I forget. Diane Warren wrote Ghost Town. I should know.
Yeah, I'll find out here. And as I look this up, this is now I want to throw this Tom Peterson story out to you and see if you know about this. So Tom Peterson, who left the band because he wanted more songs, his songs on the album. So he went solo and it didn't work out.
And he was married to Dagmar, a German model, which he recorded an album, Tom Peterson, Another Language. I will say, I'm like not throwing shade on Tom, because obviously, I mean, he is the inventor of the 12-string bass, and he is a huge part of the Cheap Trick sound. There were definitely some shows where he was close to not showing up, not because he was like too fucked up or anything. It was more, I think, Dagmar really was whispering in his ear about being, like you said, a bigger star. And it's funny, the actual trades would report at the time I put in the book, they didn't even report that like he was out of Cheap Trick. It was like, oh, Tom's working on a solo album. I mean, it's the most Cheap Trick thing ever to like have Tom essentially fly home, replace him, and then just not even announce it. I mean, Pat Francis had said it. He was on the All Shook Up tour. Like, he was like, he didn't even know that Pete Comita was in the band. They weren't like.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, that's a sign of the times. Nowadays, you wouldn't be able to get away.
No, and I think it's very. I put it in the book. It's so Cheap Trick. Like, I again, Comita was a guitar player. He had a curly mop of brown hair. But yeah, I mean, Tom went back to New York City during that time. He ended up playing in a band called Sick Man of Europe, which was actually one of the early Cheap Trick bands. And yeah, I think Cheap Trick might have needed a break from him. I mean, the reality was Rick, of course, framed it in a joke, but he said, when he was always asked about why Tom wasn't in the band, he said, he went on sick leave. Oh no, he said medical reasons. We got sick of him, which, I think it was definitely two ways. He wanted out, and I think they were definitely sick of him. I'm sure they had to officially make, I don't know if it was like the Doors where each person got one vote, like the way it's depicted in the Doors movie, but they definitely had to make a group decision on Tom. It worked out, I guess, for both parties. But I mean, he is obviously a huge, Tom is a huge part of the Cheap Trick sound. I mean, you can't hear Speak Without, or Forever Hold Your Peace, which rolls over the credits of Over the Edge. I mean, it's Tom playing the bass, but it's almost like it just sounds, I mean, again, it was a different instrument. I mean, so it's hard to imagine Cheap Trick without Tom. But you were going to
Bob Mitchell and Nick Graham, by the way, wrote The Flame. All right.
Right. I think I only credit Nick Graham in the book.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Hey, I won't be long.
So here's the story. 1983, Sammy Hagar forms a very quick one-off type of project with Neil Sean, Michael Shreve, and Kenny Aronson on bass. But the story is that they offered that gig to Tom Peterson. Have you ever heard that?
I have not heard that story, actually, which is weird because I mean
that I heard from Tim Derling. Just wrote a book on Sammy, so he was telling that story on his appearance here. That Tom Peterson was he was a possibility that he was going to be part of that project.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure it's true because Tom was obviously hugely respected, and the thing about Cheap Trick again, and this is what I would get into, I guess, in a second volume, is that around the time of The Flame, they're starting now to get people who grew up on Cheap Trick and who are becoming stars themselves, and people you wouldn't necessarily think of. I mean, Slash was a huge Cheap Trick fan. When they first started playing gigs in like 86 with Motley Crue, I know Rick was kind of like, I don't get why Motley Crue loves us so much, but then he became, Nikki Sixx is like an enormous Rick Nielsen fan. And in his book, The Harriman Diaries, he tells a couple stories about, being fully in the throes of addiction, peeing on Rick's like raincoat that he was wearing, this kind of like rubber punk stormtrooper jacket that he had. Of course, they're opening up for Rat at that point. But what they're hearing from people is, you guys are great. Like, you used to be great. They're hearing from people who, and the Flame is not changing that perception one bit. So they're getting on MTV. Obviously, they're getting now to play big arenas again. They play back at Madison Square Garden, albeit as an opener for Robert Plant in July of '88. But that's also got to fuck with them because Rick, the demo of the Flame that was presented to them, Rick famously grounded under his boot because he thought it was just kind of just shitty. But I think it was also he was being told by the record company that he didn't have it anymore, that he didn't have the songwriting magic anymore. And he, even said it in his induction speech, even if people don't always, if I don't always love my song. So they come back, they're back in the, pop zeitgeist, but for somebody they don't really like, which in the beginning, they weren't even really playing it at live shows. That's what I mean. They played it in '88, but like they kept it out of the set list for a while because whereas they used to be the I Want You to Want Me band, now they're the Flame band. And, although I Want You to Want Me, I think is a great song. And I still love the live version. Not sorry, Tom Werman, not the color version. I mean, I've never really turned to the Flame. And this is also after a decade of, and there are people who love every part of Cheap Trick's catalog where there's Mighty Wings, that the song from Say Anything. They did a song for 1992's Gladiator later, not Gladiator with Russell Crowe. They did Up the Creek. They did Spring Break. I mean, so Tom comes back and they're big again, but not for like something that they are particularly proud of or even that they really understand. It does allow them to keep going, and they are now. I mean, I think at that point I included an LA Times interview. I think it was Dennis Hunt interviewing Rick, and Rick said, "We're to the point now where we've come back more than we've been on top." People say it's like another comeback, but like it's now at this point. And I included an interview that you can hear on YouTube. Steve Harris was the translator for Rockford on Japan. And there's an interview with Rick after, I think it was conducted after the Japanese show, but when they finally get back to Japan in '88, and you hear Rick he's much more mellow. It feels like Rick is out of character. But they ask him, how come you haven't been back to Japan? They ask him in Japanese. And he's like, because we weren't invited back. They hadn't been back since 1980 when Komita came in, which those shows I assume were booked with the impression Tom Peterson was going to be there because they were like August 17th. I think they played Yokohama in 1980. So, he's frustrated. And you hear in that interview, Rick talk some shit about people that are big at the time, that he doesn't love Springsteen's voice because Tom Love was out, and he talks about Bon Jovi, even though they had, I believe, shared some time on stage. So, just evidence that, Rick, I'm sure, was frustrated that they weren't successful, or that now the Flame was becoming this thing that they were kind of carrying around as a burden.
Almost like the song was becoming bigger than the band itself.
Yeah, which you could argue now they have a great guitar solo in it, and Rick will say that they made it into a Cheap Trick song, which I think they did. But yeah, I mean, there are still people that I think that see that, and that, right, like you said, and that echoes back to Budokan, or even to their original bio. This band has no past, because people didn't really know Cheap Trick, but they were also industry people or people that work for Cream or Circus or promoters. They were being told about this band, that the original bio of Cheap Trick that was written by Eric Van Lustbader, talked about them meeting in Europe and having all these kind of like weird kind of espionage level stories, and that's just not true. They're four Swedish guys from Rockford. That's who they are. Tom changed his name, Bun changed his name, Rick is really named Rick, and Robin's really named Robin Zander. But that's always been the thing, is the image or the hit or the gimmick bigger than the band? And is that because the band itself is just these really four hardworking guys from Rockford who love to play music? And is that not enough? And that's the thing about the Flame, is that there are still people. I mean, they now play it at every show. I did see something that somebody posted. They played in Bethlehem in 2011, that Eddie Trunk wrote the set list. He's a huge Cheap Trick fan. And they didn't play the Flame, so I wonder if that was, a conscious thing on Eddie's part. But now they play it, and especially when they're opening on these tours, with Rod Stewart and Def Leppard and Hard. Like, I mean, there definitely are people that would be bummed if they didn't play it.
Right. Booked on Rock podcast. We'll be back after this.
Never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, say, "I'll be right back," because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
This is where I want to ask, to wrap things up, as to what you would like to do maybe next if you do write another Cheap Trick book, is the story of them post the Flame and seeing how they survive through the 90s and they hang on, but then all of a sudden there's this groundswell of Cheap Trick. Okay, This is a great band. A lot of the newer artists are talking about them. A lot of the classic artists are saying they inspired, like you say, Nikki Sixx and all these bands that love them. So then the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it's like, now they're a celebrated band.
Right.
So that's a story right there. Is that what you
yeah,
are thinking about?
yes. I mean, only because I did so much research for this book, and I mentioned the Dr. Rick print on the internet. What I would do, I tentatively would call it Too Dumb to Quit, the fall and rise of Cheap Trick, because Rick has always said in interviews we're too dumb to quit. Even Kid Rock, who I think the material was written for him at the induction speech, mentioned that Rick has said he's too dumb to quit. Certainly the 80s, but yes, in the 90s, I mean, a lot of things happened to them. I mean, first of all, the raw sound of those Jack Douglas albums become fashionable again. Grunge becomes huge. I mean, you mentioned obviously Nikki Sixx, but I mean, Billy Joe Armstrong, huge Cheap Trick fan. I mean, Billy Corgan. There's a Melody Maker article where he's talking about Cheap Trick. I mean, these people are literally begging them to get off of these, like, it wasn't quite county fair level shows, but I mean, again, another Cheap Trick thing. It's almost a badge of honor that they'll play anywhere for anything. Although Rick did say, you can read it, it's in The Guardian 2016, that he wouldn't play the Republican National Convention. He made a joke, like, we're going to make guitars with swastikas, which, a lot of the people, I'm sure, Kid Rock especially, wouldn't want to hear that. But yeah, I mean, there was a huge come down. They're opening for bands that used to be opening for them. And then in the 90s, yeah, they become, when I discovered them, they become hip again. But, it's like you said, how do they survive that? It's kind of an amazing confluence of events because, they do Wake Up with a Monster, which had Templeman.
I love that album.
Another, and the only Cheap Trick album to not have the logo. We didn't talk about it, but the infamous Christopher Crowe typewriter logo. I put it in the book. They're on Beavis and Butthead. Beavis and Butthead are making fun of the video. And Bun had told me that, he doesn't have kids, but that his, nieces and nephews, he got a lot of mileage out of being made fun of by Beavis and Butthead. They do say, like, he's the drummer that looks like he looks like the guy that Bogart all the beer. But like nothing is going right for them. And then in 1995, they part ways with Ken, which I think, and again, there was obviously legalities there. Again, they wanted to keep going and they were frustrated. Like, how do we keep one foot in the past, not become a legacy act, or if that's the thing, but how do we stay current? And they start doing these trick fests, much like Kiss conventions. I think I don't know if it was Ramada in 1995, but they realize, how beloved they are by, it's not going to necessarily make them on the cover of Rolling Stone, but how beloved they are. And simultaneously, like you said, Pearl Jam plays Budokan in February of 95. Eddie does a little vocal tag, I Want You to Want Me. I did meet, through researching this, Rob Kilroy, who is a super fan I found online because his wife, as a writer, wrote about him. He actually turned out was a roadie for them for Pearl Jam now in like 92, 93. And Mike McCready especially, and Jeff Ament, and I didn't know that I would obviously be using Mike McCready's forward. I mean, they were like, the way I would find out if somebody had a rare dead board that I'd never heard. I mean, they were pushing him, they were trading tapes, they wanted, like, he had the video from Budokan. I mean, they were that level of Cheap Trick fans. So by 95 now, they're getting referenced by all these bands, Nirvana, the stuff that would be in a second volume. You'll see in the last chapters where I did a lot of the, this is how Cheap Trick pops up in pop culture. This is their story. And Kurt Cobain, obviously dies when they're promoting Wake Up with a Monster in Japan, of all places. And there's an interview, you can see it online. It was on Axwave, which was a Japanese interview show of, Rick and Robin, talking. And they had just found out about, Kurt Cobain. And Kurt Cobain did say, it's in the liner notes to Incesticide. He makes a comment about, with another, we could have been basically Nirvana, that is. We could have been like a version of the Knack or Cheap Trick with louder guitars. I don't think Kurt Cobain was a huge Cheap Trick fan. I know Dave Grohl was. But then again, Rick makes a comment. I mean, he's really shaken, obviously, by hearing about Kurt Cobain. And he does say later, like, every generation has to have a martyr like this, and Jim Morrison. But he does mention, which everybody started to talk about, like the story with John Lennon, that Kurt Cobain was a Cheap Trick fan. He said he was a big fan of ours, and that becomes a big thing in the 90s. Like you said, everybody's name checking them. Like I said, the Beasties, the 70s show, that would probably, I mean, again,
it was cool to like Cheap Trick.
Right. And again, that's when, and they are now celebrating Budokan in 98 with all this stuff, and they're playing it. The road to getting them to the Hall of Fame, I don't think was so easy. I think they were up for induction, say 13 years, but it got to the point where they got it on their first try. But I know, there used to be that Got Trickford website that I think Grohl, Chad Smith, the Chili Peppers, I mean, every single person, becomes like, mentions Cheap Trick, and that of course makes them relevant again. But it's funny also. There's an element of the Cheap Trick fan base, that as far back as the mid '80s. Like why do they sully themselves by opening for bands, right? I mean, I read an interview or an article from 1990 from the Buffalo News about them opening for Heart the first time. I mean, this was 1990, and they were like, "This is such a great band," and I know. Billy Joe Armstrong, I think, was a neighbor of Rick Nielsen's. He left him like a note in the 90s, like on his porch, like, you guys need to, you need to like remember who you are. Like, you're fucking Cheap Trick. Like, how are you doing this to yourselves? And then they played Lollapalooza, which turned out to be the Ramones' farewell tour. There's some footage out there of a ponytailed Robin singing Surrender with Joey. Yeah, and they try it. They put out, that great album in '97, that self-titled Cheap Trick album, which, again, very intentionally, 20 years, I guess, from the first Jack Douglas album. It's in black and white. It doesn't include them. It has, on the front this time, it has Rick and Bun set, and on the back has, obviously the bass, and I forget what's on the back that alludes to Robin, and it's their best original album since Dream Police. I don't know. I mean, there are people who will stick up for it.
I gotta listen to it.
Oh, and people love it. And of course, it's on Red Ant Records, which I think was headed out here in Glen Cove, and it immediately goes bankrupt. And then, so they have this great album that nobody hears. They play these songs live. And then again, like I said, 20 years, Budokan is 98. And that's when I think, on one hand, they're psyched to commemorate their great work. It comes out in a complete concert, like I said, that I first heard. And Bruce Dickinson works on remastering the tapes, and they resequence it so that it sounds like not the exact set, because again, Budokan was 3 shows used. And that must have been really weird for them. I mean, I know Carrie Baker worked with them publicity-wise. I don't know. Like I said, it must have just been a weird feeling because, again, kind of like in 1977, they took their shot to maybe have that late career, although, I mean, who knows what late career is for Cheap Trick, later in career success, and it doesn't land, not because the songs weren't good, because the album goes bankrupt. And then that's also when they re-record in color unofficially with Steve Albini, which also becomes the stuff of legend. And why do they do that? And what does that say about Tom Werman? They have, I think, a Sub Pop single, right, around that time as well. So they're becoming, again, big in grunge circles. But 98, they go back and they re-release, Budokan, and they end up playing them. And those were great shows. I Wish I Had Gone. They played, Fan Club, which, I would have loved to have heard. It's only in their first Ardent demo, and they did all this, I think the last Irving Plaza show, they made a joke about Gene Simmons, they had a fake Gene Simmons there. I forget if it was Halloween, but it must have been weird for them because they can't really reconcile. They have one foot in the past and one foot in the present. And again, like I said, they keep popping up. Rick is in Disorderlies with the Fat Boys. He appears on an episode of Boy Meets World. I mentioned Beavis and Butthead. They're always kind of there, or were they? Are they no longer popular enough? So it just must have been very frustrating. And that's what I'd like to get into, I think, like in a second book. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think maybe there are people who didn't want to necessarily speak the first time around that might be more interested if the book does well enough. Once it got into the variety list, which, that was also because some of the writers are also huge Cheap Trick fans, but they did like the book. I mean, that gave it a sense of legitimacy that maybe it didn't have before, as opposed to I mentioned Government Mule. Danny Lewis, who is the keyboardist for Government Mule, apparently, I'd forgotten this, was in the Sgt. Pepper Vegas Cheap Trick shows with Cheap Trick. And apparently he's still good friends with Rick Nielsen. I did not know this. A friend of mine is friendly with Danny. So yeah, he sent in the book, and I didn't realize that they still, to this day, talk. So maybe he'd be interested in talking about that. Those, of course, were the last shows really that Bun played with them, and that was the source of the initial tension. Although again, it didn't come out until 5 years later. But I think Bun had wanted them, if they were going to play Vegas. And if you look back, I mean, Bun might have had the right idea, because I'm not saying residencies are the right thing. I mean, I don't know, Santana or anything, but his attitude was, if we're going to do this, we should do it for a giant block of time. He had also, of course, had back surgery, and as early as 2001, Dax, had subbed for him. That ends up, and again, in a weird Cheap Trick kind of contradiction, it's the Beatles that, kind of breaks them apart, because they cover Sgt. Pepper. Half those songs, a lot of those songs were never played by the Beatles, certainly not live. And the genius of Cheap Trick is they were always kind of shaded as being the American Beatles, and they play that album so fucking good that they remind people, hey,
oh yeah,
if we wanted to be a Beatles cover band, we literally would have been the best Beatles cover band there ever was. And if you ever listened to Robin cover Rebel Rebel, or stuff that's out there from when they were doing covers. I mean, they could have been. They just,
When they did Magical Mystery Tour, they included that on the greatest hits in the 80s.
Great.
My older brother had the cassette. I just remember hearing that version. I was like, oh, yeah, these guys are definitely fans of the Beatles, and they are doing them justice, too.
Yeah, I know. That when they come back in, with the drums, I mean, that bun is, and that's the genius, again, of Cheap Trick, is they had to almost hide how big Beatles fans they were. And if you listen to, again, this is something Rick is very, long before Easter eggs or fan service became terms. You listen to, and Ain't That a Shame? There's the little down, 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 down.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that was, and again, I spoke to Steve Berman in Pitchfork. He had said that he felt like all of Cheap Trick's sound was generated from the middle part of Birthday by the Beatles. I mean, Dave Marsh obviously was a huge writer before he became Bruce's de facto biographer. He was huge with obviously Cream. He felt that Cheap Trick had lifted certain elements of, it was the heavier Beatles. It was not the 60s
right.
Beatles. But yeah, I mean,
still though, just the way the songs are crafted, the hooks, the harmonies, melodies.
That's what Bun said. It's just the volume. You could either be loud or you could have harmonies. You couldn't have both. And he's like, and because we did that, we were, the American Beatles, or we were, likened to the Beatles. And again, that is a very heavy burden to carry. And especially in the 70s, I mentioned Beatlemania. I could get into this in a second volume. When they worked with George Martin, I mean, George Martin was not Sir George Martin. He was obviously George Martin and the Beatles. I don't know that working with George Martin had some of the prestige. I mean, it was a huge deal and a huge deal for them, but I don't know that it was necessarily, that was also a weird time. Again, John Lennon was killed in 1980. Obviously, the Beatles have never left us and are, continue, obviously, as long as they keep finding Peter Jackson directed nuggets of video in the vault, we'll keep putting them out. But, I mean, I don't want to say that their fame has ever ebbed, but obviously it's gone up and down in different ways. So, yeah, I mean, the Sgt. Pepper shows, it's amazing. I mean, again, those songs are so complex, like people pointed out. I mean, the Beatles didn't even play them on stage. Paul now obviously played certain songs, but they did them all, and they sounded great. And obviously they, did some versions at the Greek with Joan Osborne, and they had, some supplemental, arrangements. But they could play them. I mean, if they wanted to, and that's the genius. Like, of course, we're Beatles super fans, but they couldn't say that. That's what I found so interesting, was that when they were blowing up Cheap Trick, you'd see elements of it. I mean, I saw the original Budokan, the actual questionnaires they filled out, like that went to, I guess they were in the Japanese fan magazines, and they asked like Tom, like favorite composer, and he put like, John Lennon, like Richard Nielsen. But like in public, you could see interviews with Tom where he'd be like, oh, everybody thinks we're like the Beatles. Like, I mean, come on, like, everything they do isn't great. Like, you're not going to be playing This Boy when you're like 40 years old. They almost had to hide it. There was a great interview with them, Diane McLean, who did the Rolling Stone piece, where they were riding around in their GMC Beachcomber that they got for the Love Gun tour that they drove to Canada. And they were trying to drop her off. And like, she was mentioning, and she's a great writer, so she was mentioning like all the different scenes in the bus. And, Tom is, I think, humming a Beatles song. But like, again, publicly, they had to act like, well, no, we're not influenced by the Beatles, because just like the clip that appears in the Beatles 64 Ringo, when they're asked, you guys are just American Elvis Presleys, and he's like, but that's not true, and he does the Elvis thing. I mean, they really are like a fascinating band. And one thing I will say about Cheap Trick, you ask me, like, you get tired of like listening to them? I don't. I mean, again, I stayed to the 75 to 80 part because that's what I thought everybody knows about them. I wanted it to just be about Budokan. That's what I thought the average person, if I was looking to be more broad in my appeal. I mean, again, there are people that are obsessed with Dan Fouts like I am, but that isn't necessarily going to be a thing. That's where I think I could really get into the next part of their story, because it just they really are just fascinating, because they're always with us or they've dropped out. Like, it's not really like they did need to come back, but at the same time, like they kind of were just always, they were always playing no matter whatever it took for them to get on stage. It was opening fine. They didn't love that. I'm sure they didn't love opening up for Rat. They would, only Bun really spoke on that recently in a book of Greg Prado, but they just kept going and going and going, and they worked with all these producers. They tried to stay hit making, and like I said, it is interesting though that through the 80s they really did fall off. You mentioned the 90s, and you'd think they would have just been like the perfect 80s band because of the way they looked, because they were charismatic. I mean, they did do good, some good videos, But I also think, just again, they had been through so much by that time, personnel wise, some of the tension probably behind the scenes, fatigue, frustration, because, they had become so big for something that they didn't necessarily want or expect. And it just done maybe like 8 podcasts. I'm always, when I get to this point in the interview, I'm like, I'm still amazed. There's such a ripe topic, I think, to write about. But again, the problem is you're not going to get a definitive story from the members about any one thing. And I don't think, unless they're planning something, for the 50th, I don't think they're going to put out an official book ever. I put in my book. I mean, every Cheap Trick fan would read it. I'd love it, but I don't think. I mean, even the Beatles, we have the anthology book, and I have the coffee table book on the Stones. But do we really consider those to be? And Keith Richards wrote a book, I guess that's definitive. But would that even like be the definitive work on them? So,
right.
And they're still recording. I mean, the 3 obviously original members and Dax, they have an album coming out next year. I don't think they made an announcement, but I had heard.
Oh, that's great news.
They'll play obviously with Rod Stewart, and that'll be Rod's last big tour, he says. People keep asking me, like, do I think they could put out more archival releases, like that Live at the Whiskey box set? I would assume some of the problem with that is obviously that the 4 members don't really speak to each other. Bun has a lot of the tapes. Those tapes for the Whiskey box set were, I think, found in a warehouse. They were recorded multi-track at Wally Heider Studios, and that's when they were working on In Color, with Tom Werman. But they ironically never planned on releasing those, which is crazy because everybody loves them. They have, all sorts of deep cuts, the Jack Douglas stuff. They appeared on the box set in '96, and then there was a Record Store Day release, the Out to Get You, which is a line from Hello Kitties from the first album. And now there's a 4 CD Real Gone box set, which I got it when it came out. And then I proceeded to sell it, as I was trying to pay for some of the photos for this book. I mean, I made obviously copies of it, but it sells for a ton now. If you look at it, Live at the Whiskey, 4 CDs. And I would assume that that's part of that reason they haven't put out more archival stuff. Bun has recordings, but none of them I think are multi-track. I mean, he puts them out every Monday on YouTube. I mean, he has everything. He has demos, and he has bar club shows, and he has.
Oh, I didn't know that. People should definitely subscribe to his YouTube channel.
Yes, 100%. He is him, because the Bunny's bootlegs were the series of CDs that he was putting out in the early 2000s. Again, he was, all the Cheap Trick newsletters people would, talk to him about. I mean, he had everything. So they put out a bunch of Bunny's bootlegs that had his face on it, and those were fan club CDs only. Now those are for free on YouTube. I assume, I did not ask, but I assume that putting it on YouTube is kind of a quasi-legal thing. I mean, I will admit, like I said, the deadhead in me, I've downloaded every one of them, converted to MP3, and put it on like 60 different hard drives because for some reason I think that like it'll go away. I don't know why, but
if the apocalypse comes, you still have
I don't know
some copies stored away in a safe.
I have like 13 hard drives. I don't know why. It's like an Office Space when Ron Livingston's like, I have 40 subscriptions to Vibe, But Bunny's bootlegs are great, and he, like I said, he recently put out a Love Gun opening set from San Diego on August 19th, which no audio of them opening for Kiss existed except for a really shitty audience copy of them from Seattle. They were playing I Want You to Want Me on those shows. He has pretty much everything. And what I would assume is that was also a subject of litigation because, again, he was always the band's archivist and kept, like I said, all the recordings. So I would assume when he had to sue for his 25% back, that I assume that somewhere in the legal documents, his recordings became. I mean, the Cheap Trick social accounts do promote them. I don't think the 4 members themselves will ever get back together. But Bun has been releasing them, including the ones that are only available on CD, and they're great. And they're great. Again, raw recordings of everything, like I said, demos, sketches of songs, the aforementioned thing I mentioned about Dream Police. He posted, I forget which one, but if you just go to Bunny's Bootlegs on YouTube, he has a channel. And usually him and, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, if it's Steve Ackery or Ackery, but he is Bun's friend way back in the day. I think he interviewed him like in '77. I know he's from Pittsburgh, and I know he's a Steelers fan.
Another Steelers fan.
Yes, exactly. The ghost of Myron Cope is is haunting my very presence. They've been releasing stuff, and it's great. It's great to hear, and it has, like I said, at least one of the shows with 2 drummers, where you can hear the difference. You can hear it's kind of like muffled because again, Bun has a very distinctive kind of snap, like kind of jazzy but really loud. And that was also a thing about Cheap Trick. was that, especially in the 80s, their sound system, I mean, it wasn't like Grateful Dead wall of sound, but they were really loud. Like a lot of the reviews you read about them, including with Comida, was like, they're so fucking loud. Like it's distorted. People, and in the bars, I think that was also a thing with them. They just, Rick, I mean, you could see them on the Budokan videos. His Marshall amps are like blown out. Like there's like the holes in them. I mean, they were, and that's something that Steve Albini mentioned when he was talking with Mike Vanderbilt on their podcast before he passed. Kiss, of course, looks like the more dangerous of the two bands, and yet the music they play, not the presentation, is a little bit more poppy and bubblegummy, whereas Cheap Trick, especially that stuff from 77, is much more kind of like menacing and scary, but you have Rick Nielsen, running up and down on his, personal stairs, and a Dreamboat and Robin Zander singing it, so you might not necessarily see them as that.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Can we go now, please, people? A good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow.
People should go out and get the book. It's available online, wherever books are sold. The usual place, Amazon, American Standard, Cheap Trick, From the Bars to the Budokan and Beyond. So it's out now.
There's good pictures in that too.
And where can people find you online if they want to reach out to you?
Sure. I'm still on Twitter at LucaB12, which is Luca Brasi from The Godfather, the 12 being Stan Humphries, the quarterback of the 1994 Chargers. So LucaB12 on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. There is Drunk on Sunday, my first book. Drunk on Sunday, the book, is my Instagram handle, which I admit my wife runs the Instagram, and I just write stuff. So if people send me stuff on Instagram, she'll just tell me. I'm now also on Blue Sky at LucaB12. I clearly just felt I had to squat this, like somebody else is going to take LucaB12, which was my AOL address, from 1995 anyways. But yeah, people can pretty much find me anywhere. It's really been, like I said, a pleasure doing this. It's a little outside my wheelhouse in terms of, people always ask people, if you wrote about a book, why wouldn't you write a book about dead? I'm like, because people have already done that. And whether it be David Gans, Blair Jackson, or Robert Greenfield, I have no interest in doing that. I'm obviously, a huge Deadhead. And Cheap Trick, I consider myself a big Cheap Trick fan, but not amongst Cheap Trick fans. Like, I don't ever for one second, whether it be Pat or Brian or Robert Lawson. I mean, I've seen Cheap Trick a lot. I love Cheap Trick, but hopefully the little part of me that, I can't say that I'm objective. I mean, hopefully that's what allows me to research and to write. But I mean, I do think they're great, and they really are. I mean, they're like comfort food. I mean, they're like a grilled cheese and bacon. I mean, when I hear live Cheap Trick, I mean, when Pat was playing those songs in his podcast, I was like, what a great fucking band,
Absolutely. Ross Warner, thanks so much, man.
My pleasure.
That's it. It's in the books.